Thank you, Lisa, and welcome to everybody. It's lunchtime in Europe. I don't know what time it is for you, but thank you for joining in. So we have three speakers who are going to address this key question of academic research and the challenges we face on behalf of our patients. And then at the end, there will be an opportunity for question and answer, which I will moderate. So first we have Theodora Goulioti, who is the chief exec, essentially, of BIG, based in the Brussels headquarters. Then also from Brussels, Vassilis. Forgive me, Vassilis, if I try and pronounce your surname, I will offend you, so it's probably better not to. Who is from the EORTC headquarters, the director there, also from Brussels. And then Ines van Lewis from Institut Gustave Roussy in Paris, and also a member of the BIG executive board. And these three will give us insights into challenges and successes in the space of getting research done that addresses the needs of patients. Dora, can I hand over to you, please?
Yes, thank you, David. And we will try to share with all participants the challenges we are facing when we try to secure funding for our academic research. We can go to next slide. So for non-profit research organizations,
Dara, if you want, you can request control, so you can move.
Maybe it's safer that you change.
Okay. Yeah, no problem. I can do that.
Okay. So for non-profit research organizations like BIG and EORTC, we have three models of running international clinical trials. We run registration studies in collaboration with the pharmaceutical industry, for which a pharmaceutical company is the sponsor of the study and provides full funding for its conduct, as well as the drugs that are used for the study. We also conduct investigator-initiated studies, for which an academic entity is the legal sponsor, but the pharmaceutical company provides the drugs used for the study and partial or full funding for its conduct. And finally, we run studies with very limited or not at all involvement from a pharmaceutical company. For example, they may provide only the drug, and which we call fully academic. Next slide, please. So, although the pharma-sponsored studies are not the focus of today's discussion, I would like to take this opportunity to emphasize that both BIG and EORTC, when they engage in such collaborations, they only do it when the element of academic independence is safeguarded. This means that for such a collaboration to go forward, the sponsor has to agree that for the protocol development will be done in collaboration with academic partners. The database for the study will be held by an academic entity and not the sponsor itself, and that academia will have the leading role in the analysis of the data collected. This model over the years has become more rare, since pharmaceutical companies have become increasingly reluctant to engage in these kinds of collaboration. When it comes to investigator-initiated studies, companies will only provide funding for the studies, the study ideas that fit well with their internal development plan. An original idea academic researchers may have that does not fit with this plan will most likely be rejected. Even if the study concept is approved, the funding for such studies is usually moderate and not always adequate to cover the full cost of the study. However, companies expect some strong return for offering to cover the cost of such studies. For example, they expect to have some intellectual property rights in case an invention comes out of the study, or access to study data and the results of the study, obviously, after the study is completed. This can create two issues because for some countries, when such study is submitted to the authorities for the approval, despite the fact that it is sponsored by an academic group, it is considered to be commercial because of the rights that are given to a pharmaceutical company, and therefore running the study in such a country comes with higher cost. The second issue comes if additional funding is needed, because for the same reason, charitable organizations may consider it commercial and therefore not be willing to provide the additional funding, or it may not be eligible for this reason for grant applications. Next slide, please. And then we come to the fully academic studies. There, our colleagues in the US are more fortunate than us because they have the National Cancer Institute, which provides funding for study concepts that are approved by them. For most of the countries, however, such a body does not exist, and therefore we have two main potential sources of funding. We can submit grant applications, which usually come with a heavy administrative burden in terms of submissions and reporting. Usually, calls for proposals for such grants open with very short submission deadlines, although in order to submit a high-quality application, a lot of work is required. And in addition, the calls often do not match well with the real research needs. And then we have to squeeze the study concept into a call, which of course is not ideal. Things become even more difficult when a study is international, like the study BIG is doing and EORTC. So the few grants that are available, like the Horizon 2020 or other EU grants, are highly competitive, and therefore the success rate is quite low. And in most cases, the amount we can claim through such grants is not sufficient to cover the real cost of an oncology study. However, even if the amount received from the grant is not sufficient, if the application is approved, the sponsor of the study has to deliver the study, and this is, of course, a risk for the sponsor of the study. The second source of potential funding is through fundraising activities. This is usually difficult for studies that involve a drug, since there is a perception that if a drug is involved in a study, there is always a potential gain for the company that has a license for this drug. And there is a strong reluctance to support the cost for the central management of the study, although without this work, studies would not be feasible. And Vassilis, in a few minutes, will go in more details about the different cost drivers for clinical studies. Next slide, please. In general, and since the COVID-19 pandemic, raising funds for clinical research, and in particular for breast cancer research, has become increasingly difficult. If you think of the world context, war, inflation, natural disasters, climate crisis, there are so many important social causes now requiring funding, among other things, and then you can imagine the tremendous work that is needed to be invested by fundraisers to secure even a fraction of what is needed to cover research costs. There is also a lot of competition because of the different organizations active in clinical research, but also with organizations that are not focused on research per se, but not all people can understand which are the purely research organizations. An additional challenge for finding raising funds for breast cancer research is that in many people's mind, there is a perception that the breast cancer issue has been resolved, which is clearly not the case. Fortunately, despite all the difficulties, there are some exceptions. The Breast Cancer Research Foundation, based in the US, is one of them and is dedicated to ending breast cancer by advancing the world's most promising research. And it does so by supporting research not only in the US, but beyond that, and for many big activities and stuff. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dora. It's a good summary of some of the challenges and a few opportunities. Vassilis, how is it from the EORTC?
Hello. I'm attempting to take control. Okay. And I will stop doing that because a presenter view appeared. So would you mind presenting again, Lisa, and I will tell you next.
Okay, no problem. I'm sharing the slides again. Okay.
Yes. So indeed, I will continue from the presentation of Dora. She presented very well what are the different scenarios where we might seek funding for, and what obstacles or challenges we face at each one of them. I will say the same thing, stressing a little bit more technical detail. So let's go to the next. So we're asking for funding to do clinical trials, but why we cannot just get together and do these clinical trials using a lot of our spare time, as so much of research has happened in the past. So clinical trials are big endeavors. They're big experiments on humans, and this explains a lot of the complexity, because experiments on humans are very heavily regulated for good reasons. And there is a certain way that we need to do things to make sure that we do not do something inappropriate, and also to be able to show that what we do and prove that what we do actually makes sense and will lead to some improvement, will not be a wasted effort. So almost every clinical trial these days has a central trial office. It's either a clinical trials unit or it's a permanent office like a EORTC, or a contract research organization, otherwise known as CROs, so private entities that run clinical trials. And this needs a lot of dedicated, trained and specialized staff. So a big part of the funding needed for clinical trials goes to the people actually doing these clinical trials as their main occupation, as their main job. Of course, a lot is happening at the participating sites. In clinical trials, we call hospital sites, usually regions and countries, because the patients are there. The patients do not come to the clinical trials unit or any central office. And the activity needed to do clinical trial, to enroll patients in clinical trials, treat them, record their data and follow them up appropriately, come on top of the regular clinical activity. It can be argued that they improve the clinical trial activity, but still it's something that the hospital will not do otherwise. So we're obliged, and it's correct, we have to compensate the extra activities that these structures have to undertake that they would not have to undertake otherwise if the patient was not in a clinical trial. There are some processing fees, which is not the biggest expense. In modern clinical trials, we try to do a lot of research on the tumor samples to understand the biology of the tumor, to be able to make discoveries that will inform the next generation of treatments, or will optimize the current generation of treatments. Optimize in the sense they will tell us whether we prescribe these treatments to a subset of patients that do not really benefit, or we don't prescribe these treatments to a subset of patients that would actually benefit. And all this work usually needs external expertise. So private companies that will collect the tissue samples, transport them, do the quality control, labs that will analyze them. Labs could be academic, could be private. And all of this work needs to be compensated because there are private companies doing that for profit. And it's something that we increasingly need to take into account. This adds some complexity, which I will explain shortly. And of course, there are some miscellaneous fees. Now, a little bit more detail on how all this moves around, and let's go to the next slide. So, that was the study after the slide after the next. I will not talk much about it because Dora explained very well, other than add the detail that grants can be central. So big grants like the BCRF and grants that go to the sponsor, go to the central trial office to distribute wherever it's needed. But there are also grants that the individual hospitals can seek from their own region and their own country. And usually these grants stay in the country. They are used for the activity that needs to happen locally. And these pose challenges because you can imagine we can have a trial running in 10 countries and 4 of them might have local funding. The rest might not have local funding. And the central facility also does not have local funding. So this makes it quite complex to accept these grants for the 4 countries that have them. And of course, we always fall back to our own funds when there is a funding gap. Sponsors are accountable. Dora said that. Therefore, we cannot stop an endeavor midway while having patients under treatment. So we understand that sometimes we put our own funds at risk whenever we are starting a clinical trial. That means that funders in a way set research agendas because they make funding available for particular diseases, sometimes particular treatment types, sometimes particular treatment approaches. And since that is what gets funding, that is what gets done sometimes. It's a narrow version of what Dora described when we have disasters across the world or other causes like climate change. Funders will set the agenda of what research gets done partially. Now let's go to the next slide. The costs, as you might have understood a bit from the distinction between central and peripheral facilities, there is a fixed cost to do any trial. So to go through the regulatory work, to get permission to do the trial, to build the protocol, build the clinical trial database, build the clinical trial plan, the cost for all these activities is the same wherever we have 1 patient in the trial or 1,000 patients in the trial. Okay, it's work that needs to be done no matter the size of the trial. So this is what we call fixed cost. It's there and it's fixed. We can reduce it by doing less, by being more efficient in doing the work, but we cannot reduce it by doing a smaller trial. In contrast, there are the variable costs, which are basically the cost per patient. The cost to see a patient, to record their data, to do the tests, to give the treatment, and then at the central facility to analyze their data, to report their adverse events, to do whatever work is needed to communicate with the site about each patient. And these are the variable costs. And of course, you understand this is very different by having a trial of 10 patients versus having a trial of 1,000 patients. So it's always a combination of the two. And that means that a clinical trial that might use half the patients of another clinical trial does not mean half the cost. It means more than half the cost because of the fixed cost. The second important point to understand the reality of clinical trials is that when we have a funder, even when we have a pharmaceutical company that funds a trial where academia sponsors, so not their own trials, our trials, the funding agreement is a grant. It's a fixed amount. It is decided. It's agreed upon for the following few years. It is dispersed. It is given to the central facility at regular intervals or at milestones, but the total amount is fixed. In contrast, when we are having external providers to transfer our tissue samples, for example, or do our monitoring services, or do our biobanking, or do whatever it's needed to be done outside the central facility, these are service agreements. So we pay as we go. And that means that the price of the same service in 2-3 years from now, that is well within the duration of a normal clinical trial, might be very different. And in this world, it's much more commonly higher than lower than the price we had a few years before that point. And that means that whenever we agree on a grant, which is fixed, we take additional risk. The last few years, this has been more challenging because prices, especially in transport and services, in similar services, increase much faster than the previous years. We had not planned for that. We did not expect it. And that means that many clinical trials of many academic sponsors the last couple of years have financial issues just because of this. Okay, it did not used to be the case before. I repeat, grants are commitments. When we accept a grant that even partially funds a clinical trial, we commit to do the full trial, and the sponsor cannot leave that accountability. Even if if parts of the activities are delegated, accountability cannot be delegated. The sponsor needs to finish the trial as committed. Next one. So what are we doing about it? It sounds all this, it's so difficult, so much against us. It's not exactly the case. We have options. So we start when we understand that price increases are a real risk. We start planning our budgets with small increases expected the following years. Not every funder accepts it, but some of them do, and they understand why, and they are living in the same world that we live, and they know what is happening. We try to be as vigilant with cost as possible, to try to have lean processes, to try to have as much staff as needed and no more than that. And also double check when we add something to a clinical trial as more biological research or some imaging, whether this will provide enough value, enough scientific value for the money, for the cost. It's an assessment we do not always have to do. We are stricter with it right now. We just want to make sure that it's worth it. It's worth the risk. Even if we have the money, the risk is there. So we need to make sure that's worth the risk. The last point is that we try to have relationships with bigger funders that will fund a bigger part of the study. Imagine if we find a funder that is willing to fund something like 20% of the study. To get this 20%, we need to sign that we will commit to do the full study. That's a big risk. So we start with the big ones. We start with a big percentage of the cost with the first funder, and then we certainly have the option to go with smaller funders to top up that full amount and make sure that we will be able to do the study, and even do more if we are very successful. At the end, it goes back to the scientists who design the studies. It starts and ends with the science. What will attract more funders, what will attract bigger funders, what will make the study run faster and therefore expose us less to increased costs that might happen if the study lasts for more years than foreseen, is to have better studies, to have studies that are attractive for doctors, attractive for patients, and attractive for funders. And that's why all of us, we put so much attention in the scientific part, in the scientific design of every study. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Vassilis. I mean, I think both you and Dora have painted a picture which is accurate and honest about the challenges, why it costs money to do good quality research, because in the end, if we're doing research to help patients and their doctors and their healthcare providers, it needs to be of sufficient quality to be acceptable and to give answers. And at this point, some of you may be thinking, why on earth do we do this? It just sounds like hard work. It's challenging. The answer is we do it on behalf of our patients, but I'm hoping Ines will give us a more positive picture that it is worth doing and that there are ways through this challenging landscape, and then we'll have an opportunity for some questions at the end. Ines, time to lift our hearts, make us feel it's not so depressing as Dora and Vassilis have honestly painted. I'm not belittling them, but it is a difficult world.
So what I'm going to try to do is to show you, share a little bit of my personal experience I have been faced a lot of challenge, but I think I have faced enough success to be very optimistic about the future of clinical research. So these are my disclosures, and then I have another disclosure that is not a conflict of interest, but it's to say that the next slides are just a reflection of my personal experience and views. So just bear this in mind. So before I go to the next slide, I want to give you a little bit of my background. So I'm a survivorship and quality of life focused researcher. So since the beginning, the only way to get the studies done was through academic funding. So the industry part of the funding was never very available for me. So since the beginning of my research career, I always try to build studies and to look to academic funding sources. Next slide, please. So when I started to think about academic funding sources, there are several classical sources of funding, from charities, philanthropy, national, international, private foundations and societies, institutional funding, national governmental funding, and in the Europe side, the European Union Commission, and of course in the US there is the NIH funding. So, and all these academic funding sources, they come with different amounts, so they can fund different size projects. And they also come with different requests. So as it was said, often for the national governmental and for the EU funding, there is a research agenda, and either our projects fit or don't fit. So in this environment, how did I build my career? Next slide, please. So I'm Portuguese, and so that's the first context. Is I come from a country that doesn't have a huge amount of funding available, but that belongs to the European Union that has mechanisms that allow us to collaborate. And then I moved and I did part of my research, education and career in the United States. That is a country that has a lot of funding opportunities, but also a lot of competition. And more recently, I married a French, and I'm in France, that it's a country with a lot of opportunities. So in the beginning, I benefit from some charities and philanthropy funding that gave me a little bit in Portugal, actually, that gave me a little bit the flexibility to start to learn how to do research. And that put me in a good position to have Career Development Award from the Portuguese government that allowed me to go to the US. And in the US, I was in the US 6 years. Basically, I learned to do research, and I was very fortunate to have a mentorship that allowed me to participate in building some big size grants that I was not leading, but I was participating in, and that allowed me to learn how to be able to apply to different grant mechanisms. So in the end of my stay in the US, I was awarded with another Career Development Award from a foundation, from a US foundation, Susan Komen Award, that was very important from the beginning of my independent career in France. And in France, so it's a very fortunate environment, because either my institution, but also the national level. We have the several grant mechanisms that are open and that are able to fund either mid-size but also big-size projects. And of course, being in France, this gives me being successful in having some grants at the national level, this gives me a better platform to then be competitive and applying to big size European projects. So there are all these sources of funding that gave in different moments of my career the ability to have projects ongoing. And next slide, please. But this is really the tip of iceberg. So in order to be successful in getting this type of funding mechanisms, there is a huge piece of the iceberg that we don't see, that it's about editing, rewriting, writing, thinking, researching, having ideas, dreaming, and it's about failing. I remember Eric Weiner in one of my first years in the US, he told me, if you want to be successful in doing academic research, you have to try 10 times, you will get one fund, you will be good. So it's a lot about being resilient. But I do believe that when we have a good project, a project that will impact the life of our patients, we are able to find the good funding mechanism that will allow us to make this project happen. So next slide. So, and this was the case of the Canto cohort. So the Canto cohort is a survivorship-oriented cohort, first just focused on breast cancer, but now that is also including other type of patients with other type of cancers. So now we open, for example, the lung cohort, and it's a cohort that is built like a clinical trial and that capture over years the survivorship and the quality of life issues of our patients. It's a deep cohort, so it captures not only patient-generated data, but also captures biological data. And it's a cohort that was totally funded by the French government, first with a 12 million funding mechanism that was Fabrice André that got it. And then when I was already in France, we got the renewal of 5 million. It's a cohort that is led by Fabrice André and myself, and in the setting of a big consortium that is sponsored by Unicancer. And I think is an example of a success story in clinical research, that we were able to build this cohort that now has over 13,000 patients, and that I think is really on the way to be a sustainable infrastructure in the future. So I think examples like Canto are examples of fully academic efforts that were sponsored in this case by the French government. Next slide. So what are the solutions? I think one solution is keep trying. You believe in a concept, you map the resources, and there is a lot of resources. I acknowledge that the resources are different in France that are in Portugal, for example. But if we network enough, we are able also to create consortiums and create networks that are able to push towards the success. I'm Portuguese, and my success came from the support that I had from my Portuguese mentors, from my US mentors, and from my French mentors. The other thing is, in addition to this traditional funding, is try to think about other sources of funding. For example, at the French level, now sponsored also by the French government, there are technical clusters that are being created that link academia, startups, venture capitalists, and with this idea of trying to accelerate and boost concepts, innovative concepts that otherwise would have difficulty in being funding. Another idea that recently we started to explore is to partner with entities that we would not think about as options to fund our research, like third-party payers. A lot of the research that we do, it's, for example, disease escalation research, and can be interesting for the social security, for insurance, to partner with researchers and try to help put these concepts together. So, for example, my colleague Joana Ribeiro, she's with BIG and EORTC. She's like trying to put together a concept that is called opt-pembro of de-escalation pembrolizumab, and with EORTC they initiated a conversation that tries to go in this direction with the social security here in France. The other solutions, next slide, please, is changing the way we think about research. So we saw, and I think it's very important, that one of the reasons that research became so expensive, it's because it came with a lot of professionalism, with industrialization. It comes with a stamp of quality. But I do believe that we can keep this stamp of quality and try to use things like technology to help us to decrease some of the costs that we currently face in research by making the research easier, by automatizing some of the processes that we are in place. And I do believe technology will have a big role on this. I think part of the solution is changing a little bit the paradigm towards fully digital enabled research. So currently, we have a structure of research that needs in-person visit for consent, that needs extensive data collection, that not always we need all this data, that needs visits, then extensive visits for the intervention, for the follow-up, that has collection of patient-generated data that is not always done in the easiest way. So we still do a lot of in-paper collection that mostly is concentrated in great centers that exclude a lot of patients from social economic background. So it's not so general and doesn't reach everyone that could reach, that often has limited patient involvement, and that always starts from the beginning. Every project, we start from the beginning. So what about a world where we could have a lot more home-based consultations? We could do e-consent, we could retrieve data in an automatic way, we could do some of the visits using telehealth, we could reach more patients because we would have been paid more attention to equity and how to reach patients that often we exclude. And that we could have an infrastructure where infrastructure built for patients and with patients, where more quickly we would arrive to recruit every patient to every clinical trial. So this would be a world where we probably will spend less time doing our research, where we would have more representation, we would have more reach, and the costs maybe could be lower, because a lot of the data would come directly from the patient. Next slide. So in my idea, if we could have a totally digital enabled research where technology could in somehow substitute a lot of the processes that are currently have to be done by humans, where the patient is in center. And so a fully patient-centered research could have much more patient involvement and could be much more quicker in recruiting patients. And where we would go to the patient, we would go to what already happens in the patient journey to collect the data that we need. So really a streamline of digitally enabled research from the beginning until the end of the research process. I believe that a world like this would be a world where we would have less costly research, and where therefore would be easier to do big multinational practice change pragmatic research. Next slide, please. And so I believe so much on this that we currently are funded by the French government to do a national infrastructure that would allow us to have the tools to do fully digital enabled research. So the French government gave us an infrastructure grant of 11 million euros exactly to build an infrastructure to streamline and to cut some of the costs that currently the research needs to have enabled to happen with quality. And this is for me.
Ines, thank you very much for giving us two, I think, important things. Firstly, your own success story, which is, as you said, a lot of hard work. We start with small things and gradually you build up a research profile and a portfolio of funding. And portfolio of funding is important because the different things that people want to do will appeal to different funders. And then secondly, I think for highlighting the fact, and I'm trying to remember the quote, but essentially, if we keep facing the same problem in the same way, we are unlikely to find a solution. That the solutions will have to sometimes come from outside or left field. And as you suggest, there are constructive ways I think we can look at making the cost in terms of time and money for doing research less by building different infrastructures and potentially therefore enabling more research to be done with the same amount of people and the same amount of money. One of the areas which we've sort of all of us have touched on is that we do research not just for our patients, they are ultimately the audience, but also for those who provide the healthcare that those patients and public get. And you did touch on that there is a need to engage with the healthcare providers. Where you have a national health system, such as we do in the UK and you do in France, and a national health research funder, which we do in the UK and France, then you have an opportunity to do that at the national level. But most other European countries don't seem to have that model. And yet they have healthcare providers. And I guess one of the questions for all of us is how do we get the healthcare providers to realize that actually research shouldn't just be something they do for profit to deal with their increasing challenges of funding their healthcare, but actually to do because it's good for the patients and ultimately it may be even good for the healthcare provider. How do we best engage with those healthcare providers? I don't know if anybody has any ideas as to how we do that. You touched on it, but for Dora and Vassilis working internationally, how do we reach out to the providers for them to see, actually, if they enable research, we may improve the quality of the outcomes for their patients, less toxicity, better cures, but also potentially save them money if they are giving drugs they don't need to give. Has the EORTC had any success in that conversation with any of the other European countries? Vassilis, do you know?
Slight. So, but it's getting there. Everybody needs their time to learn. We have to understand there are many different players and they are learning at different speed. And they all learn from each other. So I can confirm that national funders have started to understand that they need to be a bit more active, not stay passively waiting for the evidence to come to them. They need to plan for it. And actually, they started to realize that in case of de-escalation, for example, that Ines mentioned, that means giving less treatment instead of the treatment that we standardly give. they would actually make money by making the trial. So paying for the trial will make money during the trial from less drug that they will have to pay. Now, efforts like that have started in different countries, and we have seen successes. We also seen a few efforts that are less successful because small countries start to realize that they are not enough. They cannot do this research unless they devote 15 years to it. So they need to get together with other countries. And this is what's actually happening right now. There is an effort in Benelux. There are efforts in some other countries in Europe. And it will take some time, but I think they will get there because they all have to benefit. It's just stupid not to do it. We just have to. They just have to learn
don't say
how
it
to
quite
do
like
it.
that.
It's not so obvious because healthcare budgets are national.
Mm.
Research
Or regional.
It's original. It's easier for research to cross borders, but healthcare does not cross borders so easily. And we are asking here healthcare players to participate in research. So it will happen, but it has a natural speed that we can accelerate a bit, but not by a lot.
Dora, from a big perspective, we are not so often engaged in a conversation around who funds healthcare within trials, but have we got any examples you can think of where we've at least discussed that or considered this approach?
Well, we actually tried to discuss not with health providers exactly. If you remember, David, a few years ago with a representative from the European Medicines Agency, because also we felt that the agency could put some pressure for some academic concepts, questions that are never addressed by pharma to be explored, like the duration of treatment. But we were not very successful in the sense that EMA, as the regulator, has to follow a certain process, and they could not make a difference on those aspects. But we have not directly contacted health providers. The main issue is what Vassilis said, that they are national, and in many countries they are a lot. You need to have the discussion frequently. In some countries, at least, you need to have it in the local language. So it requires a lot of effort and time investment to do that across countries.
Thank you. I'm not seeing any questions from our audience. So perhaps I'll raise one other thought, which again, we have touched on. We do our research ultimately for our patients. Ines, this is an area I know you have a lot of interest in around understanding the experience of patients and involving patients. Any simple message around the question of how we better engage with patients in the design and conduct of our research, because the conduct is often the challenging part rather than just designing a trial?
So I have two thoughts. So first, I think now it's becoming like mandatory in everything that we do. Like I speak about my group, but I think a little bit overall to really engage in co-creation, really since the beginning, engage in education of patients and have their input since the conception of the concepts and over the journey. And this allows us to really then be much quicker in the impact and even in all this, in recruiting quicker, in having in recruiting quicker, and then in having uptake of whatever product we want to prove with the study in the end of the project. But I also think when we think about patient-centered research, there is this piece of co-creation that I think it's really becoming like a piece of how to do research. But I do believe that if we want to be transformative, our way to do clinical research has to be truly centered in the patient and not in the centers. So what I would like is that in some years from now, that the patient has the ability of share their medical record, and the patient, that the recruitment can be done in a much more global level. And this will allow us to have a reach and a representative that we cannot do now, because everything is segmented in the pathway of care where the patient is. That is different between countries, that is different within the countries. And so I think now it's co-creation, and I hope that in some years will be really patient, totally centric research.
Thank you. And I've just been reminded that we had a few questions that were sent through in advance of the meeting. So I want to pick up one or two of them, which are relevant. So there's one from Nigeria, which is asking the critical question. And this was discussed actually to some extent at the St. Gallen conference earlier this year, which is, why are clinical trials so heavily concentrated in the high-income countries or advanced economies, whereas the LMICs, the lower and middle-income countries, seem to find it much harder either to do their own research, but equally to take part in research that is funded, for example, by the pharma industry. Vassilis, can I come to you? Because clearly the EORTC has to make decisions about where and how it can sponsor research. And I know that's never easy. Do you want to make a comment about the challenges in the LMICs and what we perhaps could do jointly to reduce that much barrier? Any ideas?
Yes. It's an interesting topic, and we have tried a few times.
I know. That's why I asked you.
So I try to give straight and short answers. So first, we need to admit that the research that is designed in the rich world cannot be applied as such in a low resource setting. Cannot just take our trial and open centers in Nigeria or in Central Africa. The environment is not the same. Okay, we cannot ask them the type of exams that we do, for example. We cannot ask them the type of visits. We cannot ask the same type of documentation. So this has been one barrier. A second barrier for simple question has been that it's often the requirements that local presence is needed to be able to do something. And that might be overcome by pharma, but then on the other hand, pharma does not do simple trials. But it's impossible to overcome for academic entities that need, in fact, to become multinationals to do that. So the way I see the solution is that we need to meet each other in the middle. So a little bit we can discuss together, and the low resource setting can at least put in place the basic elements so that an external sponsor can come in and plug into that, so they take care of the local environment. And the second, that's a bit more evolutionary, but it gives me more hope, is instead of asking rich world questions to the low research setting, is to do the opposite, to get the questions from the low research setting and see whether we can ask them worldwide. And very frequently, these questions have not been answered at all worldwide because they don't bother. It's a simple question, is something old, is something like that. But there have been examples of research originating from India, for example, that has global appeal and obviously can only be designed in India and not in the United States or the UK or Europe, for example.
And just to be fair, we have a regular annual meeting funded by Breast Cancer Research Foundation, BCRF, between the North American and the rest of the world researchers in breast cancer. And this exact topic came up, which was a lot of the discussions around the trials in local treatment in the high income countries are de-escalatory. Can we do less surgery, less radiotherapy, less whatever to the axilla? But actually, in other countries where the vast majority of cases are advanced breast cancer, they are needing to ask different questions. And this topic was raised. There isn't an easy answer, but we need to be aware of each other's needs.
Yes, and just to add to that, our de-escalation trials are trying to reduce, for example, the duration by half or something like that, or the dose by half. Instead of 3 weeks, we do 6 weeks. We've seen proposals coming out of low-income countries where they reduce the dose by 1/20th or 1/10th. We don't dare do that. So that's what I have in mind when I say they need to step up.
Yeah, No, I think that's fair enough. We are coming to the end. I got one last question for Dora, which is interesting from a perspective. One of the questions is,
sorry, David,
sorry.
we have some questions in the chat as well, in case you didn't notice.
I'm
if
not
you want to
seeing
check,
any.
if you
I'm not
check
seeing
on the
anything
Q&A.
in the chat.
We don't
We don't
We're not
see
seeing the
anything in
chat.
the chat. No.
That's why I wasn't picking stuff
You
up,
have
because
to.
I'm not
It's
seeing
not the
anything.
chat. You have to click on the Q&A. It's just right next to the chat on the top.
Ah, sorry.
Okay.
Okay, so I was going to
They
come
just arrived
to.
a few minutes ago, so
Yeah. So I was going to come to the one about the early career researcher in the last minute, because it links to what the last two slides are. But before I get there, Dora, is there a responsibility for funders of basic research to see that this gets pulled through, do you think? How do you make that engagement between the clinical researchers, and we're all largely clinical researchers, and those doing the more basic research? It's patented by university, there's tech transfer involved. How do we engage to make sure that there is pull through from that basic research into clinical research, do you think? It happens within companies. What about outside?
Outside companies, David, I think, sorry, can you still hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes. I had an interruption. So outside the pharmaceutical companies, unless a pharmaceutical company identifies an academic researcher doing basic research that interests them, there is not much link between basic researchers and clinical researchers, at least at an international level. And this is an interesting point raised, because although state funding is not given so easily for clinical research, there are more opportunities for basic research. So, but for example, for an international organization like BIG, we have researchers within our network a lot, but it's more to link to the basic clinical researchers within their network and bring that on the table, because there is not a lot of dialogue beyond the local level. That's my opinion.
And in my experience, it's a challenge even within a single institution.
Yes.
Actually creating the dialogue between your clever laboratory scientist and your clinical trialist, even within a single institution, is challenging. So work where you are and then use networks like BIG or the EORTC to bring it up to a wider audience.
Yes.
We are at the end of the hour. Can we see the next couple of slides, please? Lisa, if you can advance the slides. So firstly, thank you to my panelists and all those who have joined in. A little bit of conflict here. So I want to bring to your attention the 14th European Breast Cancer Conference in Milan towards the end of March next year. Why? Because this final slide tells you another opportunity for those of you who are at the early part of your career to try and get your ideas across to an audience and get some funding. As Ines has said, and it's my own experience, your first research grant may be a few €100 or pounds, depending, or dollars, wherever you are. But from such little amounts, you can gradually build a program of research. And in the next, go back, please. Go back, Lisa. So in the next EBCC, we have a new idea, which is there are 2 awards, one for a multidisciplinary team and one for a young investigator award, so that people who come up with an abstract that goes into the conference with some very interesting new data, there'll be up to 2 awards, one in each of these areas, to give you €5,000 to take forward your research idea and grow into a career and a whole series, hopefully, of practice-changing trials. So bear that in mind when you're looking for other opportunities. You just need to submit an abstract and make it clear that you are applying for one of these awards as well. And the final slide, please. Breast cancer is tragically, despite what some people think, a disease from which many, many people still die internationally. And so this year's big campaign is taking the idea of I miss you, because we've all got people in our families and in our clinical workplaces who have succumbed to this disease. So please take that message out wherever you are to encourage people to give, because with giving to BIG, EORTC and other groups, we can continue to do research to address the needs of our patients. Thank you all to the panel, and thank you all for joining, and have a good day, and good luck with your research, whether it's small or big. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you
Bye.
very much.